This is They Create Worlds, episode 247, The History of Commodore, part 4.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called reality, you'll find me there.
Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey, and I'm joined by my co-host, Alex.
Hello.
We join you once again post-stream to talk about what we have talked about for 3 episodes, Commodore.
That's right. It is a rare 4-part episode here at They Create Worlds. We've done it a couple of times, but don't do it often, as we find ourselves once again turning our attention towards Commodore International. As recent listeners will know, we did a 3-part look at Commodore as our annual live stream, interacting with the folks, and it was not nearly enough time to cover this complex company. So we are going to do a round 4. This was not part of the live stream. This is a regular episode, but we couldn't leave people hanging with the disastrous launch of the Amiga. You know, honestly, Commodore is such a complicated company. We could, and I'm not kidding, we could probably do 2 more episodes on Commodore. We're not going to. We're going to keep this last one fairly high level so we can get through all of the craziness that happens, but it's wild. The post-Jack Tramiel years are just a time of ping-ponging back and forth between competing priorities and never quite getting it right, and they have a few good years in there where they do okay, but they never reach the heights that they could have if they had a better idea of what they were doing. We're not going to get into all the last technical details on all the various Amigas, of which there were legion. For that, I definitely encourage you to check out Brian Bagnall's trilogy of books on Commodore. We'll kind of give a high-level idea of what the whiplash looked at the company and what was kind of driving all of the insanity in this 4th part of our Commodore International extravaganza.
So, for a brief recap, we had everything going on with Commodore. We had the release of the C64, and really it was the C64 that was sort of like Jack's grand magnum opus at Commodore because of a falling out between him and Irving Gould. He left. Then we had things sort of be weird with this whole Amiga company, it coming into existence, it becoming of age, all this great graphics stuff, trying to shop that around for a video game system and a computer stuff, trying to get Atari to buy it. Jack is trying to grab Atari. That scares the crap out of Amiga, so they go running to Commodore. Commodore bails them out. It's an entire mess. They launched the Commodore Amiga 1000. It was good from a gaming perspective for the most part, but its emulation of DOS kind of sucked, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, it was caught, as we said last time, it was caught in this weird space because it had started out as a game machine, like literally a video game system. It morphed into a computer. Because it started as a video game system, it was really well suited to games, particularly for the time, with some decent resolutions for the time, even if most of them were interlaced. Some decent colors, and the whole bit-blitting thing, which allowed it to do transforms and deformities and shadows particularly well. So all of that was great from that perspective. Unfortunately, Jay Miner and the team had been pushing it more and more in the direction of a business computer. So it ended up being too expensive to really be a game system, but not capable enough to be a business system. It did not have internal expansion slots. It had one external expansion port that you could try to fiddle around with, but limited expandability and no real DOS compatibility. They tried to do it in software and it didn't work very well, but also it lacked the high-res modes that you needed for the business software, things like databases and spreadsheets, where your goal is to get as much information on the screen at any given time as possible. In this time period, a lot of business machines were not colorful machines. I mean, we ourselves have made fun of the 4-color CGA graphics on the early IBM PCs, for instance, but they still sported higher resolutions, either in monochrome or in 4-color. For business computers, that's all you needed, and Amiga just couldn't get those high resolutions. which was a real problem, but it was so expensive that it really couldn't just be a game system either. So it kind of missed the market both ways. And the initial release of the Amiga 1000 just completely flopped, and Commodore lost money.
Yeah, that's really amazing to think about, to be in that kind of state. Jack really was, for better or worse, the guiding vision for Commodore. He would very much be like, hey, this is what we need to produce. Here's where we need to go. And most of the time, he was right about where things needed to be. A lot of people didn't agree with him, but more often than not, you don't get to the C64's success without Jack.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he had his blind spots as well, particularly in not understanding the value of software. But when it came to kind of understanding where there was a soft spot in the market and pushing Commodore to exploit it, he was great at that, and he had his ups and downs, as we talked about in our previous episodes. But certainly, when he saw that ZX80 and made the pivot into what he called computers for the masses, not the classes, he ran them into something big, especially as they got into those mass market retailers like Kmart. Right. At this point, as we may recall, the CEO of the company is Marshall Smith, who came out of the shipping industry. He had no feel for these markets. He'd never been in consumer electronics. He'd never been in computers. Really hadn't even been in consumer products, period. Forget about electronics. He really didn't have a way forward for the company. And as I talked about, I think 2 episodes ago, I don't think it was ever really meant to be Marshall Smith running the ship. Because, at least according to Bagnall's book, the initial idea had been that Marshall Smith would come in as president, with Jack Tramiel staying as CEO, because Irving Gould wanted a more established businessman to kind of grow out the company at this point, because Jack ran it very lean and mean. There was no middle management. He had control over everything. He was signing off on all expenses of $1,000 or more. Once you get to $1 billion company, that's not necessarily going to work anymore. So I think what Irving Gould probably wanted was Jack Tramiel's drive and sense of the market combined with Marshall Smith's understanding of how to structure a mature company and have them work in tandem. But then, of course, Jack Tramiel decided to leave, and so that couldn't happen. Where does that leave Irving Gould? Because really, especially now that Jack Tramiel's gone, Irving Gould is the driving force behind the company. He has that big stake. Started at 17.9%. At some point, it gets up closer to 20%. I'm not sure if it's there quite yet at this point, but he is the largest shareholder. That may not sound impressive, but in a publicly traded company, that is a lot of shares. He is the largest shareholder. He is the driving force. He's the one that wants to make sure that this company is doing well so the stock runs so that he can maintain his lifestyle. So what does he do at this point? First of all, it's clear that Marshall Smith is not going to be the answer here. They're friends. He brought him in for his business sense, but he's too slow. He's too unaccustomed to the way these markets work. By this time, he's also gone south on this whole computers for the masses thing. Because we have to remember the C64 and even the C128 aren't the only computers that Commodore was releasing in this period. They also had the absolute debacle that very nearly killed the company of the Plus 4. We have this home computer market falling apart, which we talked about on our Home Computer Price Wars episodes. Irving Gould doesn't think that this low-end mass market is where the company should be anymore, quite frankly, because he thinks it was all a passing fad. TI's out of it. Commodore's still in it with the 64 and the 128, but the 128's not selling as well as the 64 was. The Plus 4's a disaster. So it looks like they're falling out of it. It really feels like the market is going back towards the high end. It's going back in the direction of Apple. Apple has released the Macintosh, and yes, the Macintosh had its own ups and downs, which we'll probably talk about in some future episode of They Create Worlds. This seemed to be the market to chase now, the kind of small business market, the desktop publishing market. Of course, Apple is so enmeshed in the education market. It feels like education, small business, big business. This is the way things are going again. The PC is doing better and better, while the PC Junior was a flop. The Macintosh is a little bit up and down, but it's going for a higher-end market. Jack, of course, once he buys Atari and is coming back in, his Atari ST is not high-end, but it's basically his MO, his modus operandi all over again, which is, there's the Macintosh, let's build something cheaper than the Macintosh, and take away their market, which is what he's doing with the Atari ST. And of course, the Amiga's kind of living in this space as well, but as we said, the Amiga has just had all sorts of terrible problems. Gould in this period decides he really wants to be Apple. This is something that kind of motivates him for most of the rest of the history of the company, much of the time to the company's detriment. He wants to become Apple. He wants to inhabit that space.
He really wanted to directly compete with them, sort of like how we learned with the Seven Dwarfs that directly competing with IBM is probably not a smart idea.
Indeed, but and yes, absolutely true. But it's not just that he wants to compete with them. It's almost like he wants to kill them and wear their skin. He wants to be Apple.
Obsessively so, you're saying. Sort of like certain movies and certain things that are not appropriate for children.
I need to feel the kill. But no, and obviously, I mean, he's not, that psychotic or anything. I mean, obviously there's a little for comedic effect there. But he really does want them to become Apple. So right in the same period that the Amiga stuff's happening, because we kind of need to back into that same period, because in our last episode we focused on Amiga, he's also focusing on what he needs his executive staff to look like, since Marshall Smith's clearly not working out. Well, in this period, Apple has its Pepsi executive as CEO, John Scully. Gould decides that he will get his own Pepsi executive to run his company, one Mr. Thomas Rattigan.
If you want to compete, why don't you go for the Coca-Cola executive instead and have the more professional company that's actually really good at beating the other one?
But not in this time period. And this is why everyone was going for the Pepsi executives during this period. Because this is the period when Pepsi was starting to seriously challenge Coke's dominance. They came up with this really innovative, fresh marketing campaign around the Pepsi Challenge, challenging people to taste Coke and Pepsi and blind and determine which they like better. And people are starting in this period to appreciate the sweeter taste of Pepsi. They're starting to appreciate it so much and eat into Coke's market share so much that Coke decides to change their formula for Coca-Cola to make it sweeter. And that's how we got New Coke.
Yeah, that didn't work out well at all.
Indeed.
Not to mention led to many conspiracy theories about that one.
Exactly.
See the show notes for a link to that rabbit hole if you're interested.
Absolutely. But the fact of the matter is, Pepsi was seriously challenging Coke in this period. And, it was no just flash in the pan. Like, it was a serious challenge. And there was a lot of innovative marketing strategy that was going on at Pepsi, which is why it became so sexy to hire some of these marketers in the tech world and in other worlds where they might bring some of that marketing savvy to other products. That's why Steve Jobs courted John Scully. And that's why Irving Gould in 1985 hires Thomas Rattigan, former marketing executive at Pepsi, who had risen to be the CEO of the international division of the company. He was no longer with Pepsi by this time. He had left, but he had held many prominent positions in Pepsi and in marketing. So he brings him in 1985, initially as COO and head of North America, Commodore Business Machines in North America, but with the intent of having him take over the company within a year or so from Marshall Smith. Like, it's all planned, it's all arranged. So early in 1986, when Marshall Smith's still there and, the Amiga had launched and wasn't doing very well, Rattigan had a big meeting with all of the high-level people in the company, and Marshall Smith was there as well. They all met together to figure out what exactly do we want to do here, really. It seems like to Rattigan that the way to go is to really re-embrace that low end that they were getting away from with the Amiga 1000. Because the C64 did very well in 1985, better than they had been expecting. The 128 was not setting the world on fire, but it was doing okay too. It feels like these low-end products, plus 4 aside, were the products that were doing well for Commodore. And it was this Amiga 1000 that was kind of falling apart. So kind of out of these meetings in early 1986, Rattigan comes to kind of 3 basic conclusions. He wants to extend the C64 and C128. Extend those out, continue to make them viable through new, more advanced versions, through cost reductions, whatever. He also wants to get into the PC clone business, which Germany at this point I think is already starting to get into because Commodore is a business standard in Germany. Since the market's turning towards those PC compatibles, those PC clones, Commodore Germany wants to be there where the business is being done. PC is just becoming very high volume in this period as it really cements itself in the business world. Rattigan sees this as kind of an easy way to boost sales. And then the other thing is, if they're going to stay in this Amiga business, they really need to cost reduce it and focus on its great game playing capabilities. Get it manufactured in the right place, no longer in Japan. Get rid of the expensive case. Do some other cost savings where you can and release a version that, even though it can't be quite as cheap in mass market as the C64, still feels like something that you can actually sell as a game machine, which the Amiga 1000 is just not. The one wrinkle in this that's kind of weird, though, is according to people that were at this meeting, as he's laying this stuff out, he turns to Marshall Smith, who at this time is still at the company. He's going to leave a little later in the year, but he's still there at this time. Out of deference to him, he's like, what should we do? What should we focus on? Smith was like, the C128. We need to come up with better versions of the C128, which was just nuts. The C128, I mean, it'll sell a few million units over its lifetime, but the C128 never did what the market wanted it to do, because even though it had C64 compatibility, that was only in the special C64 mode. It did not extend the capabilities to match the capabilities of the C128. Nobody was interested in that, so nobody was building software for the C128. So that was a dead end, but that's the way that Rattigan initially decides that they should go, is that they should upgrade the 128. And so some of the engineers start doing what they call the C256 or the BMW, which is an effort to extend a more enhanced version of the C128. At the same time, they are also taking a shot at this cost-reduced Amiga project. The Amiga engineers in Los Gatos try to do their thing to cost reduce, but they're too precious about it. They try to cost reduce while still keeping basically everything from the Amiga 1000 intact, which means that it's no cost reduction at all. Barely any savings. The main Commodore engineers in Westchester start doing their version of it as well. So they start figuring out ways that they can just shave a lot of cost off of the Amiga and make it kind of a viable game machine. That's a good thing, but this C128 extension, C256 thing is kind of crazy, and PC clone business kind of makes sense, but, it's a very confusing time. Meanwhile, there are layoffs going on because the company has been losing money, as we discussed in prior episodes. There's a round of layoffs in September 1985. There's another one in January 1986. As part of these layoffs, after that second layoff, Irving Gould brings in an outside consultant to help continue restructuring the company by the name of Mahdi Ali. Another Pepsi person, though he was a finance guy rather than a marketer. He was a smart guy. He graduated from Yale. He joined the bank Morgan Guaranty Trust, which was a subsidiary of J.P. Morgan. In 1976, he became the VP of Finance at General Motors, and then in 1980, he became VP of Finance at PepsiCo. He left Pepsi in 1984 to work for a consulting company, Dillon Reed and Company. That's how he came to Irving Gould's attention. Rattigan and Ali are starting to restructure the company. There were 2 layoffs before Ali was there. There'd be more layoffs after he was there. They're shaving down engineering, they're refocusing, and Rattigan is positive that the way to go is to embrace the low-end market. C64, C128, cost-reduced Amiga. There's just one problem. Irving Gould wants to be Apple.
That could be a problem, yes.
I mean, yes, Apple has the Apple IIe, sure. They've still got their 8-bit line, but they don't care about their 8-bit line, really. Even though it's driving a lot of the sales of the company, they're trying to get away from it. Steve Jobs is very disdainful of the 8-bit line. 8-bit line is not Apple. Even though Apple technically has one that they're continuing to extend, that is not the culture. That is not the feeling. Gould is still trying to capture that high end. So at the same time Rattigan is going through all of these kinds of things, there's also a push to improve the Amiga on the high end, particularly in Germany. So as we talked about before, the Commodore is big in the German market. Big in business computers, big in personal computers. At this time, they control just over 50% of the total market, business and consumer combined. And they are the number 2 business company behind IBM. Like, Commodore Germany is a big deal. So they take it upon themselves to fix this problem of Amiga compatibility with the PC. There's no expansion slots, but there's an expansion port. So they create something called the sidecar, a piece of hardware that has additional boards in it that will allow it to have PC compatibility. And then once they have that sidecar, they're like, wouldn't it be great if we could actually bring that internal and actually have an Amiga with slots? So they start their own kind of project that they initially call the A2500, but will be known to posterity as the A2000, the Amiga 2000, which is basically, let's take the Amiga, but give it slots so that you have more flexibility to expand it in the ways that you need to be a high-end business computer. Irving Gould is really excited about this work that's being done in Commodore Germany, and he really wants there to be a big focus on that as well. He's on board with the whole Amiga 500 thing. It makes sense to have a cost-reduced version of that, but he really wants them to focus on the high end as well. He wants the A500, the Amiga 500, and the Amiga 2000 to both come out in 1986. This is just not realistic for what's going on at Commodore at this time. Commodore had built up a massive, almost too massive, overhead in an engineering department and everything, and now after rounds of layoffs, that has been severely cut back. So continuing to support this low end of the market and try to get these 500 and 2000 computers out in 1986 is just a problem. First of all, it turns out that the computer that the Germans are working on, this Amiga 2000, has some issues and needs some chip revisions that the American engineers need to do when it comes to them. It's not just a matter of, okay, they've built it over in Germany, now let's put this thing out. It needs work. And since it needs work, what ends up happening? People get pulled off of the Amiga 500 project to work on the 2000 because that is Gould's baby. Instead of having one or both of these computers come out in 1986, we're going to end up having nothing coming out in 1986. Not only that, but as it becomes clear that the C128 is just kind of doing so-so in the market, it's not doing terrible, but it's not doing great either. By the middle of the year, Rattigan realizes he's made a mistake there, and he cans this C256 project, which makes him seem kind of very wishy-washy. Now Rattigan is in a really difficult position. He's head of the company by now. I mean, he's CEO. Obviously, Gould's still the chairman. He's CEO of Commodore International right now, but he's not really delivering any of the projects that his chairman wants. He's focused on a low end that Gould thinks was a fad and wants to be done with. He's not delivering on time on the high end for a variety of reasons. And Gould is getting more and more unhappy. At the same time, the Los Gatos engineers are also trying to create their own high-end version of the Amiga, codenamed Ranger. You know, the Los Gatos engineers are the original Amiga engineers, so they're like, okay, we've done the first version, let's do our better version as well. So there's a conflict between the A2000 and the Ranger project that the Amiga engineers want to do, which also involves a brand new chipset. So there's a lot of stuff swirling, and Rattigan and Gould are basically at odds with each other. Rattigan wanting to be in the low end of the market, Gould wanting to be Apple. So something's got to give here. So Gould does what Irving Gould normally does in these situations where he feels things are getting away from him. Because he only has, around 20% of the company. Even though he's the largest shareholder and very influential and has allies on the board, there's only so much he can do directly. But indirectly, he can bring in his friends to spy on, get a handle on, and intercede on his behalf on projects going on in the company. And that's exactly what he does here. Rattigan, in addition to losing Gould's favor a little bit in this period, is also losing a lot of the favor of the engineers because they're not happy. He seems like he's changing his mind on projects. He doesn't seem to be backing the right horses, this whole 128-256 debacle. So everyone's kind of unhappy. So in July 1986, Gould brings in a new engineer that had been kind of helping out in Germany by the name of Henry Rubin. Rubin is an interesting fellow. He goes way back. Not a Commodore, but just way back in general as an engineer. And his biggest claim to fame is that while working for a mining company in South Africa, he invented, it's not an area I know very well, but from what I've seen, he invented one of the first, or maybe even the very first electrical device that was basically a precursor to today's GFI, or ground fault interrupt. Because in mines, they were having problems with, mines get water in them, and then there's stray electricity, and pretty soon you're connecting a circuit between you and the ground, and it's very bad. So he actually came up with a precursor of the ground fault interrupt that is in pretty much every kitchen and bathroom in America, and many elsewhere as well, in the 1950s to solve this problem. So he's an engineer that goes way back, and he has some Commodore experience, too, because the company he was working for in South Africa in the early 80s also was the Commodore distributor in South Africa. Like, it was a diversified business. So he was actually involved in the South African Commodore dealerships as well. So he kind of knew the company a little bit. But he was also older. He really wasn't completely in tune with what's going on in the modern and fast-changing world of consumer electronics. But he is an engineer. He's a close personal friend of Gould. He had been helping out on some projects in Germany. Gould came to respect him there. So in July 1986, he brings Rubin over to the U.S. to be the final arbiter on all engineering projects. Rattigan is losing some capability to direct the company here because Rattigan can no longer say, I want you to build this, I want you to build that. He's still leading the company, he's still doing sales and marketing and finance administration and all of that stuff. But now Rubin has been placed between him and his engineering VP, Gerard Bucas, and is making decisions on what they want to do. Spoiler alert, what he wants to do is the same thing that Irving Gould wants to do. So he starts really slowing down a lot of projects, including the A500, because Gould really wants the Amiga 2000. Both the 500 and 2000 were supposed to come out in 1986. They don't make it. The A500 is a little further along because the A2000 needs some rework when it gets to the US. So it looks like it may be ready to go in early 87. But Rubin starts stalling and not approving development expenses, and it gets delayed to June 1987. He's kind of slow walking things as he comes in. In the meantime, the other conflict in the company is ended in March 1987 when the Los Gatos office, the original Amiga Corporation, is closed. They had been laying off people steadily there throughout the year to try to get the finances back under control. But then they just close it entirely in March 1987. A few of them end up coming back here and there as employees or contractors when they realize they need some specialized expertise. But that's the end of Amiga Corporation. They were working on this Ranger computer. It missed the mark. The A2000 was seen as the way forward. And it was thought that, if the Germans have a handle on this A2000 and the Westchester engineers are doing a better job of the cost-reduced A500, then why do we need these people in Los Gatos? And so they kind of get rid of them. Projects are not reaching fruition. Projects are slowing down. And Gould and Rattigan want different things for the company. Rattigan staying in the low end, Gould pushing more towards being Apple. This all culminates then in 1987 with Gould deciding it's time to make a change. So our good friend Mahdi Ali comes back, who had consulted on the restructuring of the company the year before. In April 1987, Gould brings him back as a consultant to evaluate management practices at the company, which Rattigan quite fairly sees as, an attack on him. Management practices is basically, oh, look, what is the CEO doing? Don't like what he's doing. Rattigan, it's so funny because there's some parallels to John Scully and Steve Jobs' power struggle at Apple. Rattigan tries to take things into his own hands and rally the board in his own defense. The board, which is a relatively small board, is still pretty loyal to Gould. That's really a non-starter. So he attempts a board coup, which is kind of the last straw, and he is dismissed from the company on April 16th. Problem for Commodore, they had just recently given him a 5-year contract.
Oops.
So they're kind of in breach of contract for firing him.
But aren't there clauses in the contract to say, for incompetence, we will get rid of you?
I mean, I'm sure there were some outs somewhere in the contract somewhere, but not like that, because after all, you give someone a contract because the U.S. has at-will employment. You can normally just fire somebody for any reason you want, and so contracts are a way of providing some faith to the employee that you're going to be around for a bit. So, we're not going to focus on that, but long story short, there's a lawsuit for a long time, and Commodore ends up owing Rattigan something like $9 million in damages for firing him very early in his contract. Whoopsie daisy. Meanwhile, there's the question of what to do with these new Amiga computers.
But we don't know who Rattigan gets replaced by.
Well, the answer to that question is Irving Gould steps in directly to become the CEO and president of Commodore International.
Irving Gould tell Rattigan what to do. Rattigan build Amiga 2000. Rattigan doesn't make Amiga 2000. Rattigan makes Amiga 500. Gould fire Rattigan, replace with himself.
Indeed. Now we enter a very interesting period in the company, and we are going to keep it very high level because we've been talking about Commodore for a long time, and I don't want to get too in the weeds of this. There's a series of moves that are now going on within the company. Gould really wants them to be Apple, and he really wants to take control as much as he can in especially the North American market. The Amiga 500 and the Amiga 2000 do come out in 1987, and the Amiga 500 is a great success in Europe. Because in Europe, the marketing people and the general manager there, they understand that this is meant to be a game machine that they're trying to get in the hands of the mass market. So they treat it that way. They do a lot of bundles where they release bundles of the system with hit software like Deluxe Paint or Defender of the Crown, and usually these bundles have multiple games in them. Most famously of all, in 1989, they do a big Batman bundle. That's the year the big Batman movie comes out, and Ocean is creating a licensed game based on the movie. David Pleasance over there negotiates a deal with Ocean to bundle it and make it exclusive to these bundles with Amiga for the first couple of months. They do these bundles, they push the games, they push it mass market as much as they can, and they sell a ton of them. They sell like over 100,000 in the first year. They sell a couple million of them or more over time because they recognize it's a game machine. In the United States, that's not what Gould wants. Gould wants them to be like Apple. He dismisses a lot of the people that were close to Rattigan, including Rattigan's replacement as head of North America, Commodore Business Machines in North America, Nigel Shepard, and brings in a guy by the name of Max Toy to be the new head of Commodore Business Machines, which is the North American branch of Commodore International. Max Toy comes from IBM and Compaq, Compaq being at this time the most important PC clone manufacturer, and had recently done a turnaround job with the company ITT. He's a salesman. He knows how to sell computers into channels. He's a big proponent of the Amiga. So that's all great, except Max Toy is being, told and pushed, and his own experience is that we have to sell these into the specialty retailers. We're not going to try to get these into the mass market. Of course, by this time, the Nintendo Entertainment System is coming, and it is kind of pushing its way into the mass market and beginning to displace the C64. Video games are back, and it's creating a bit of a problem. But Commodore is not helping themselves, as Max Toy and his marketing VP, Frank Leonardi, are trying to push into specialty retailers. Commodore no longer has great relations with specialty retailers, as we've talked about in the past in the United States, because of their move to mass market and the way that Jack Tramiel did that was very harmful to those specialty retailers. So they don't have the capability to flood that market. They're doing their best to try to increase their share in those specialty retailers vis-a-vis other computers. And this is the period of time that they finally eclipsed the Atari ST, which initially was doing better than them because of the poor cost structure of the Amiga 1000. But they can't really push into these specialty retailers. Sales languish. The Amiga 500 overall, a big success for the company. It right-sizes. It's the moment that Amiga takes on and defeats the Atari ST, and the Amiga is recognized properly as the great game-playing machine it is. But most of that happens in Europe. Most of that does not happen in the United States, and from this point forward, there's going to be continuing imbalance, where way more of the sales are coming from Europe, particularly Germany and the United Kingdom, than are coming from the United States, something that is always going to annoy Irving Gould and is going to cause him to go through presidents of Commodore business machines at a somewhat alarming rate.
Why wouldn't he just think that what I am doing here is really speaking to something in the European market, focus more on that, consolidate on that, and go, okay, we need to reassess how we're doing things in the United States, or just pare back what we're doing in the United States?
So, I mean, there's a couple of reasons here. First of all, I mean, they let Europe do their thing. Irving Gould lets Europe do their thing. He doesn't stop them. Commodore has always had this weird kind of decentralized structure. The product always comes out of the United States. I mean, yeah, they have some engineers in Germany, and they may have one or two scattered elsewhere, but primarily their engineering is in the United States. The product comes out of the U.S. And then because of the holding company structure they set up when they first established Commodore International as a Bahamian corporation, each of the general managers of the various branches tend to have a lot of autonomy in how they run their businesses. With the exception of the U.S., because, you have Commodore in the U.S. Commodore has head offices in the Bahamas, but it has its executive offices in the United States. And then Commodore Business Machines is also in the United States. So the president of Commodore, or the general manager of Commodore Business Machines, is always in close proximity to the president/CEO of Commodore International, whether that's Jack Tramiel, Irving Gould, whoever. So they have a lot less autonomy there. Gould has less of an ability to influence what's going on all around the world because it's set up to be run pretty autonomously and he's not there. As long as those companies are showing results, he doesn't care that much. But the U.S. is the biggest market. The U.S. is the biggest market in the world. I mean, it's the number one consumer market. It's great for them to do well in those other markets, but he really wants them to do better in the U.S. because doing that volume of business in the U.S. will just increase profits exponentially because it's just a so much bigger market. But in this market, Gould has more of a capability of exerting his own influence than he does in other areas because he can exert control over product development, like bringing in his friend Henry Rubin. He can also exert more direct influence on the head of Commodore Business Machines, the North American branch. He really feels like that low-end games market is dead, that it was a fad, that it's not coming back. It's not just that he wants to be Apple because he thinks Apple is cool. He wants to be Apple because he thinks that's where the market is. They got really badly burned by the Plus 4. Like, it was bad. So he wants to be in that higher end, which is where he thinks they'll have success. That's kind of why he doesn't want to translate exactly what's going on in the UK or Germany or whatever, because he doesn't think that's the way forward for the United States. Now, overall, the company is doing better. So they had those 2 years of massive losses in 1985 and 1986. 1987, they bounced back a little bit. A lot of that has to do with Rattigan's restructuring. Some of that has to do with finally releasing some Amiga computers that people like a little better, especially the A500 in overseas markets. So in 1987, which, remember, their fiscal year ends June 30th, in the middle of the year. In 1987, their sales decline a little. They were at $889 million the year before. Now they're at $806 million. But instead of losing over $100 million, they turn a small profit, $28.6 million. Most of that is the restructuring. But they're finally on kind of solid footing again, and it looks like they have a way forward because the Amiga is finally starting to find some traction, even if there's a mismatch between the traction they're seeing in Europe and the lack of traction they're seeing in the United States. So the logical place to go from here is just improving the product, because they still have a situation with these early computers that they don't have great graphical modes going forward. There's a lot of color, the blitter stuff is cool, but they don't have those higher resolutions. And PC is catching up rapidly because we're getting very close to the VGA standard being promulgated on PC, 640 by 480, non-interlaced. So the logical next step is to extend the chipset, which Commodore can do because they have the Commodore Semiconductor Group, formerly called MOS Technology, which obviously we've talked about in previous episodes. As we talked about before the Los Gatos location was closed down, the Los Gatos engineers led by Jay Miner were starting that process with something that they called the Ranger. That was the code name of the new Amiga they wanted to do, but it was also the code name for the next generation chipset. There was just one problem with it as that chipset continued forward even after the Ranger computer was canceled. At the high end, they were really leaning into monochrome, which, as I said, was something that back in that day when graphics memory was very expensive, was something that a lot of business computers did, was in their highest resolution modes, which have the most pixels and therefore need the most memory. They tend not to be as colorful. The only thing is that by this time, as computers were getting more sophisticated, as memory was coming down in price, pure monochrome at the high end wasn't necessarily the standard anymore. So a lot of the engineers at Westchester, at Commodore's other location, were like, nah, we can't do it that way. We need to have a little bit of color in there, even if it's only 4 colors, like the old IBM. So there was this fight that went on between these two sides over kind of which chip to do, the Ranger chipset or what came to be called the enhanced chipset. At the end of the day, it was the advanced chipset that won out. The idea was, okay, we're doing another chipset. It's going to have some higher resolutions with some more colors. It's going to eventually, not necessarily when it first started, but eventually it's going to include a VGA-like mode of 640 by 480 non-interlaced video. Yeah, at the high end, if we're doing something like 1280 by 256, we're going to have higher resolutions, but it's going to be with a smaller number of colors, but that's really kind of what you needed on the business end. Really, at this point now, they have the Amiga 500 and the Amiga 2000. They finally have something for the low end and something for the higher end. But they can't really advance much further than that until they have this chipset. So the Ranger chipset's complete in 87. The Westchester engineers reject it. They start work on their own chipset, the enhanced chipset, the ECS, start getting seriously working on it in 1988. At the same time, they also start work on another chipset because they're like, okay, what's the next thing going to be? Because that's the problem with the Amiga compared to its competitors like the IBM PC. They use a Motorola processor as the heart of the system, as the CPU, but everything else is customized. So building newer, better computers means that they have to get a whole new set of chips together. They have to do a whole new revision of the operating system, Amiga OS, because it's all in-house. Other companies, especially IBM and IBM-compatible companies, are using off-the-shelf parts for most of this. Of course, Microsoft's providing the operating system on the side. They can iterate faster than Amiga can because they don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. Every time you want a more advanced Amiga, you basically have to start over again, reinventing the wheel. They have this next chipset, the ECS, that they need to do, and then they're thinking ahead of that as well for a 64-bit set, which they're calling the AAA chipset, that they also decide in late 1987 they're going to do and start working on in 1988. They're hoping to have both of these chipsets in 1989. Spoiler alert, they do not get either one of them in 1989. And in fact, they never get the AAA chipset. They keep working on it and working on it and working on it through 89, 90, 91, 92, before they finally cancel the thing. What's going on here? Well, the problem is they now have too little R&D for a company of their size trying to do so many chips at once. During this period of time, Henry Rubin starts taking over engineering more and more. He's named Chief Operating Officer of Commodore International in September 1986. And then in 1988, he takes over as the head of engineering as well. This guy is older. He's not entirely in touch with what's going on, and he has no project management skills whatsoever. He basically lets the engineers work on what the engineers want to work on. Now, obviously, his engineers love that. What engineer doesn't like being told, go do what you want? But the problem is they have too few engineers for all the projects they're doing. They're also doing a lot of peripheral projects because they have to do disk drives and monitors and all of these other things, special adapter boards, whatever else. They have all of these projects going on and all of these chips going on, and nobody telling them to pare back, nobody telling them when to stop. So you get feature creep, you get people going down blind alleys and hitting dead ends, and you just have too few engineers spread over too many projects. As a result, we enter a period where nothing is getting done at the company.
This is a problem that happens a lot in many companies, including IT. I fight against this myself in my own work, where you try to be agile for the company, where you're responding to requests, but also you have this problem of, well, I'm already working on this project that's ballooning out of control, and then I have the president and CEO coming in here and saying, I need this new project done. Drop everything else and work on my thing. What that leads to is nothing gets done in a timely fashion, or things just keep getting pushed further and further back until they're enough of a pain point that they come back to the forefront again. If you have a really small R&D department of engineers, and you have someone who's not managing that finite resource very well, the problem is the engineers are doing what they want to do, but they're just jumping around willy-nilly, or they like someone comes in, asks them to do something. Yeah, this will be real quick. Can you just do this for me? Nothing is ever real quick, because whatever the request is, there's always those middling details that can lead to things being a lot more complicated than what someone who's just envisioning it and doesn't really understand the technical aspects really appreciates.
Exactly. Absolutely. So they're hoping to do this enhanced chipset. They're moving on to Motorola's 32-bit processor, the 6820. They're hoping to pair this with the enhanced chipset, and they basically replace the low-end computer, the Amiga 500, with something they're going to call the Amiga 800, and replace the Amiga 2000 with the Amiga 3000. It'd be great if some of this could happen in 1988, but certainly at the very least, by 1989, there's got to be something here. They've got to keep pushing this forward because PCs are not standing still. Neither is Apple, whom they're also trying to emulate. I mean, the Macintosh is improving, but especially PCs are not standing still. They are evolving rapidly because you have so many companies attacking the problem. It's not just IBM looking for what the next generation is. It's Compaq looking for what the next generation is. Plus, you have Microsoft looking for what the next big thing in operating systems are. It's like there's this whole ecosystem that is constantly improving things. And Amiga, Commodore, is hung up for the Amiga because they have to do it all themselves. They're doing it all in-house, and they don't have the resources to do this. This really all comes to a head again in August of 1988. I say again because it feels like things are always coming to a head for Commodore. They are a drama company, Jeffrey.
Just choose the nature of the drama. Financial, legal, personnel, R&D.
Indeed. Now, the company's still doing okay. Like in the 1988 fiscal year, sales go up to $871 million. That's a small rise. Still not as high as they were in 86, but higher than 87. Profits go all the way up to $48.2 million. Like, the company is continuing to gain more and more traction, mostly because they have embraced the PC clone business. Those PC clones are great for volume. Are they going to be their biggest money makers? No. But everyone's buying PCs, so being in the PC clone business is a good thing. So they've got that PC clone business driving them. And then, the Amiga 500 is continuing to do great in the UK and Germany and in Europe. they're continuing to grow. The Amiga is becoming the preeminent gaming machine in Europe because consoles don't really start establishing themselves in Europe until about 1990. In the US, they're getting their lunch eaten. I mean, the Commodore 64 is still providing a little bit of sales, a few 100,000 every year to keep things going, but the NES is taking over that market more and more. There's not room for the C64 in a world that has the NES. Kmart has dropped Commodore in favor of the NES, and they've tried some C64 things. They did the C64C. They did a pairing with the GEOS operating system and with Quantum Link, which was an online service that basically became AOL later on down the line. They're doing things in that space that we're not really covering here because we're keeping it very high level so that this doesn't become 5 or 6 episodes. They've got this going on, but it's never going to get the company very far. Because PC clones are a pretty low margin business, so they're not going to get a lot of profit out of that. The C64, while it's still doing okay now, and even the C128 is still doing kind of okay, that's going to continue to decline as the NES gobbles up more of that market. They still can't get any traction with the Amiga 500 or 2000 in North America. Even though, you might say, okay, sales have risen a little bit, profits have risen a lot, like things are good, right? And it's like, no, I mean, this company is stagnating. And even though they're starting to make some money again, they're still kind of right on the edge of disaster because they don't have that big product they need. So in August 1988, Irving Gould calls his top people together in the Bahamas because he's trying to figure out what the heck do we do? There are no new computers on the horizon. The ECS chipset is not coming together. It turns out that the Motorola 68020, the 32-bit processors that they're going to be moving to for their next generation, they can't get it at the price they need to make a reasonable successor to the A500. So they actually end up canceling the A800. Never comes out because they can't get the cost reduction they need. They're pushing towards this A3000, but the A3000, I mean, just to skip ahead in the story a little bit, it doesn't come out until 1990. They released the Amiga 2000 in 1987. They start work on the enhanced chipset, like really start work on it in 1988. They can't get a computer out as a successor to the Amiga 2000 until 1990.
Yeah, give or take 3 years.
Yeah, which is not fast enough at the rate the world is moving here. So then a funny thing happens at this meeting. An old pal of ours comes back into the picture, one Mr. Kit Spencer. Kit Spencer, we may remember, is the marketing genius from the UK that was actually brought into the US. So you were talking earlier in this episode, why don't they just bring in the UK people and have them try to replicate the experience? Of course, they did that in the VIC-20 and the Commodore 64 days by bringing Kit Spencer in, who really unlocked both of those products. Now, Kit Spencer is happily semi-retired. He's at the head office in the Bahamas now. He's basically retired, but he works out of the office. He's like one of 2 people there or whatever, and he writes the company newsletter. But he's basically just enjoying the sun. He's still a trusted advisor of Irving Gould, so he's at this meeting. He's not going to come back in. I mean, he's happy with his Bahamian life. At this meeting, he convinces Irving Gould, look at what Nintendo is doing here. Nintendo is doing so well. This video game market is back. Games are not a fad. We should actually be back in the low end trying to compete with Nintendo because we know how to do that. We did that with the VIC-20 and the C64. He wins Gould around. So Gould's not completely abandoning the top of the market, but they seesaw back and forth. And they do this a couple of times during this period. They seesaw back and are like, okay, yeah, let's try to capture the low end again. This is what happens when you get people that are just chasing trends. I mean, Gould doesn't know the industry. There's no one who really knows the industry. I mean, they've got some computer people like Max Toy and Frank Leonardi, their marketing guy who came from Apple. They pull people from other computer companies, but they don't really have anyone that kind of understands where all of this is going. And so they just kind of seesaw back and forth, kind of whichever way the wind is blowing. So they decide, okay, we're going to go back and we're going to try to capture the low end again. Gould decides, let's cost reduce the A500, the Amiga 500 computer, and try to create a game machine, which they call the Amiga 250, just codenamed a game machine that's a cost reduced Amiga 500 that we can sell at mass market.
Didn't we already learn our lesson from the computer price wars?
Well, they're not looking at instigating a price war per se, but they think that they have a space for themselves kind of in this low end of the market where they're not currently in. So it's not about, like, they're still going to sell an Amiga 500. They're not, like, trying to cut the price of the Amiga 500 into oblivion. They're just like, let's create a game machine, an even cheaper version of it that can go head-to-head with Nintendo. Flash forward then to the January 1989 CES. Now, this is the first time that Commodore has attended CES in 3.5 years. First, they stopped attending because they were broke. Then they stopped attending because Irving Gould was no longer interested in the consumer market. They've been going to shows, but they've been focusing on Comdex rather than CES. But now they're going to move back into this consumer space. So they attend CES for the first time in 3.5 years in January 1989. At the show, they announced that they have sold 1 million Amigas. Now, it took them less than 2 years to sell 1 million VIC-20s. It took them probably an even shorter time than that to sell 1 million C64s. This is almost 4 years later that it took them to sell 1 million Amigas. It both shows that the computer has finally gotten on track a little bit after the release of the A500, but also shows that it has just not been a great time. So at the CES, they float this idea of this A250 console, and nobody's particularly interested in it. Funnily enough, with nobody kind of interested in the Amiga becoming a game console, they pivot again back to the C64 and improving on the C64. Because there's been a project going on since 1985, led by an engineer named Bill Gardai, I'm not sure how he pronounces it, who decided that he wanted to take on redoing the old 8-bit chips in CMOS so that they would be lower power consumption and could do more impressive things. In 1987, he had completed a revision of the 6502 in CMOS called the 4502 that could run at a higher clock speed. He also is slowly starting to work on a new version of the VIC chip, the 4567 or VIC-3 chip, that will be able to do 256 colors on an 8-bit system, which is
impressive.
Really quite impressive. Yeah. He decides that what he wants to do is he wants to do kind of what the C128 should have been in the first place, which is do something that is mostly backwards compatible with the C64 and expand it out with a faster processor, more colors on the screen, and really just boost it into a new generation of 8-bit hardware. 8-bit hardware that would be pretty competitive with the NES. So he calls this thing the C65. So he starts working on the C65 in October 1987, hoping to get it done by 1988, but as with every other project at the company, it's stalling. There are delays. They're having trouble getting the chips just right, particularly the VIC-3 chip. So it's still going on in 1989. The powers that be in engineering, Jeff Porter especially, who's been behind a lot of the projects going on at this time, is like, okay, well, if nobody wants a 250 game machine and we're having some real problems trying to cost reduce the Amiga 500, which is something they've also been working on, then I'm going to pay attention to the C65 project. We'll use that as something to challenge Nintendo. We'll use those chips. We're going to mostly jettison the backwards compatibility, but we're going to put a 3.5-inch disk drive in it, and it's going to be really cool. This will be the thing to take on Nintendo. So they're pivoting again. At the same time this is going on, there's another guy in the company by the name of Don Gilbreth, whose job in the company is to kind of be on the lookout for new technologies that might be interesting, who starts paying attention to the CD-ROM market and notices the coming of CD-ROM and is like, you know what we should really do? We should do a CD-based multimedia machine. So he starts his own Skunkworks project. He works close to Irving Gould. He works up in New York where Irving Gould is. Irving Gould's not with the company in Westchester. He has offices in Canada and New York and the Bahamas that he has to travel between for tax reasons, but his US base is New York. So he gets kind of cozy and close to Gould there, and he convinces him that what they really need to do is a CD multimedia machine. He starts his own Skunkworks project away from the Westchester engineers to start a multimedia device as well, which, those always go great in the early 1990s.
It went well for the seventh guest. I don't know what you are talking about. Full rendering, ghost, horror, puzzles, chess puzzles, many, many chess puzzles.
Yeah, except, this isn't a multimedia PC we're talking about. These are multimedia systems that are supposed to, fit under your television with your VCR and your stereo, which basically just combined text and audio and some computer graphics because they haven't really figured out how to do video yet.
But Leonard Nimoy told me that the Laserdisc was the wave of the future, with its 2-foot diameter disc that I have to use a forklift in order to enter into my wonderful player. Not to mention that halfway through the movie, I have to flip the thing over.
Well, these aren't Laserdisc. These are CD-ROM. But, yeah, that's a bit of a problem. So now Commodore is pivoting in these other weird directions. They're like, no, now we're going to go to the low end with C65. Oh, we're going to do a multimedia system. And Gould really loves the idea of this multimedia system because he's an old guy who doesn't understand computers. And he thinks, is this going to be the thing that finally unlocks things? Is this the thing that people are going to be able to use in the living room to get used to computers? No keyboard, just using a remote control, just like using their VCR. This is what's going to get people into computers that aren't already into computers. This is the same thing that Philips was chasing with the CDI. This was very briefly the fad around multimedia, and Commodore gets caught up in that hype as well. At the same time, we finally have new management coming into the company because, for the last couple of years, Irving Gould has been in charge of the company as the CEO and president, so running the day-to-day, theoretically. Now, he's not around. He's not really running the day-to-day, and that's part of the problem. He doesn't really want to be in that position. In 1988, the final straw is that they're having a bit of a tax problem because, as we said, it's a Bahamian corporation. That's where they're based, and they're based there specifically because it's a tax shelter. When Commodore shot through the roof and became a billion-dollar company, all those sales in the early 80s with the VIC-20 and the C64, the IRS was kind of like, you've been making a lot of money, and most of your operations are in the United States, so we really feel like we should get some of that money. Commodore's like, no, we're Bahamian, you can't do that. The IRS is like, no, we would really like those back taxes. Okay, thanks, bye. So once again, in late 1988, Irving Gould, because he doesn't want to deal with this, brings back in his friend Mahdi Ali, who has become his friend by this time, who's been the consultant in the restructurings. He's been the consultant in getting rid of Rattigan. Brings him in again to kind of deal with this tax situation. And then in February of 1989, ends up appointing him president of Commodore International. So Gould is still the CEO. He's not giving up his power completely, but he brings in Mahdi Ali to run the day-to-day of the company. Ali is an interesting character. And, we kind of talked about this in one of the live stream episodes, I forget which, but he's been having a lot of problems with getting anything happening in the company for a couple of years now for the reasons we talked about. Product is not moving. New products are not coming out. New chips are not getting done. They're still relying on their product from a couple of years ago, primarily out in the marketplace, which is eventually going to cause them harm. I think at this point, Irving Gould really misses Jack Tramiel. Tramiel has many faults. We talked about them in other episodes, but by gosh, when he wanted to drive a project through to completion, he drove a project through to completion. He was not afraid to bulldoze his way through people. He was not afraid to yell at people when he felt they deserved to be yelled at. He was a bulldog. Mahdi Ali had some of the same qualities. He was kind of a small, pugnacious guy, just like Jack was. He was in finance, not in product, so he was not a wheeler-dealer like Jack. He was kind of a tough guy, and he wasn't afraid to get in people's faces. Now, those that worked at the company with both Ali and Tramiel, of which there were several, see a difference because the way they saw it, Tramiel could be tough on you, and he could yell at you. You could suffer a Jack attack, but he really only did it when he thought you really screwed up, and at the end of it, he wanted you to learn a lesson from it. He wasn't just screaming at you to scream at you. It was his way of teaching you not to screw up in that way again. Ali just kind of screamed at you because he was upset with you. It wasn't necessarily because you screwed up. It may just be because the situation is one he didn't like. He wasn't really trying to teach you a lesson. He was just screaming at you because he was upset. He kind of had some of the same qualities of Jack Tramiel, but not really.
Not the good qualities.
Yeah.
If you have the mindset that yelling is going to accomplish anything, at least Jack's intentions are right, at least in however you want to package that, of, I'm yelling at you for a really good reason. You screwed up in a way that you could have prevented. Here's why. Here's how to improve it. Don't screw up again. The other way is just like, almost like bad parenting in a way where the kid spills a glass of water and you yell at the kid to go get a rag and mop it up. It's the difference between yelling at someone who's about to step into traffic and yelling at the kid because they played outside in their socks.
Indeed. Ali does have his faults, but there is one thing that he pretty much recognizes when he gets in, that he's correct to recognize, which is that projects are just not getting done. The Amiga 3000 finally does come out in June 1990, bringing the enhanced chipset, the better resolutions, and all of that into the Amiga fold, which is good. But there's still a lot of stuff backing up. There's still a lot of stuff that's not happening. Clearly, in his mind, and I think he's correct in this, Henry Rubin has to go. He starts by bringing in a new executive to run the PC clone business, which is going all right, in May 1990 by the name of Bill Sydnes. Bill Sydnes was a key member of the team that built the original IBM PC. He was also the person behind the PC Junior.
On one hand, good. On the other hand, very, very bad.
The people that were Commodore at the time are not sure that Ali really realized that Sydnes was behind the PC Junior. I mean, he was hiring him for being part of the PC team, not being part of the PC Junior team. He's hired ostensibly in May 1990 to run the PC clone business, but he's really there to evaluate engineering for Ali. So just like Ali was brought in by Gould to kind of push Rattigan out by evaluating management structure, now Ali is bringing in Sydnes to basically evaluate engineering and push out Rubin. So that's exactly what he does. He's hired in May 1990. Soon after, Ali asks him to report on what's going on in engineering. He basically says what we've already talked about here, that they really had no management structure, that there were a lot of meandering projects going nowhere, that Rubin didn't seem to have focus, couldn't keep people on task. In November 1990, Rubin is out, Sydnes is in. During the same time period, in 1989, there's another change at Commodore Business Machines because Max Toy has not been able to improve the sales of Amiga computers in North America. So they bring in another guy, Harold Copperman, who had been, I believe, at Apple, because they're still trying to capture that market. Gould, even though he's kind of like, yeah, we can go into the low-end market, he's still kind of like, but wouldn't it be great if we can capture the business and education markets too? So after his IBM and Compaq sales distribution turnaround guru didn't pan out, he brings in another Apple guy to be like, let's capture those other markets again. But we're kind of also working on the low end of the market too. They pivot back and forth so much. There's no focus for a long period of time. Gould is just impatient. And I'm sure part of it is that he has a short-term goal if he needs the stock to keep running. So that short-term goal is driving him to impatience. So he's replacing Commodore Business Machine presidents all the time. He's promoting different CEOs and presidents. I mean, that at least stays stable till the end because Ali stays president till the end and Gould stays CEO. But there was turmoil there before that. He just keeps churning through people like, we'll go after the education market. We'll go after the business market. We'll go after the low end of the market. We'll go into the multimedia market. They just keep trying, and they churn through these executives. And because Ali and Gould don't really know this business very well, and they're really focused on short-term gain over long-term strategy, it just creates this turmoil and chaos, and nothing ever gets better.
Very much like those investment companies that come into a functioning company or a struggling company and then try to implement a whole bunch of changes after they buy a controlling stock or at least heavily influential stock in a company. They just make changes that are focused on short-term profit, but ends up destroying the company in the long term.
Indeed. And the best example of this Kind of want to wrap things up here so it doesn't get too long. Like I said, we're going to be very high level in this episode because we don't want it to be 5 episodes. We may come back and do an episode specifically on Amigas at some point to get some of the nuance, but for now, it's just kind of like the grand overview of what's going on at the company. During this period of time, the enhanced chipset has kind of finally had its day and is finally launched. The AAA chipset is going nowhere fast and never gets done. So in between, they come up with this, what they call AA chipset, which is not as advanced as this 64-bit chipset that they're hoping to do with the AAA, but is more advanced than the ECS, which just adds, a little bit of color at the high end. This Pandora or AA chipset, which will eventually become known by the time it comes out as the AGA. It's going to be bigger, 32-bit data bus, 256 colors at all resolutions, even the higher resolutions for the first time, out of a palette of over 16 million colors. Just further trying to push this architecture forward. They decide that they're going to release a series of what they call plus computers once this chipset is done to showcase this. So they're going to have the 500 plus, the 1000 plus, and the 3000 plus.
Didn't learn their lesson from the 4 plus, did they?
From the plus 4, exactly. Everything's going to be great.
Let me guess, everything was not great.
No, because at the same time, so a couple of things happen. First of all, management does another one of their pivots and decides that the high end is not working for them. And we really want to be in the low end. So they just cancel the 3000 plus. Then they get impatient as the chips get delayed and delayed again. They get impatient on the lower end systems. So they decide that the 1000 plus is just going to be this barely updated version of the Amiga 2000. This one they already have an Amiga 3000 called the A2200 that is just no kind of improvement over the 2000, especially in a world that has the 3000. So this computer is so bad that the European general managers refuse to take it. They're just like, we are not selling this. This doesn't make sense. They do this because the AGA has been delayed. They're like, we're not going to get the AA or the AGA in 1991 like we thought we were. We're not going to get it in 1992. So Sydnes decides we got to do the best we can. So we'll turn this A1000 plus into the A2200. And it's just bad in a world with the 3000. So the European GMs refuse to take it. But the worst thing is what happens to the A500 out of all of this. The A500 is the bread and butter of the company. It's the most popular system. They really want to cost reduce it. They've tried a couple of times now, and they just haven't been able to do it. So now they've been working on something called the A300, which is supposed to be a cost-reduced version of the 500. The problem is they can't get the cost down. They try new techniques with the board and everything that actually end up raising the cost. So what is supposed to be a more limited version of the Amiga 500, the Amiga 300, instead morphs into the Amiga 600, which is basically a nothing kind of computer because they're trying to cost reduce. Like, it has a couple of things that an A500 doesn't have. It has the ability to have an internal hard disk drive, which most people are not clamoring for in a low-end computer in the early 90s. Hard disks are starting to come in by this point, but no one's really clamoring for those in a low-end computer. And it has a PCMCIA port. So you can use that to do some expansion of the hardware. PCMCIA, for those that may remember these times, that is a port that you insert a little card into, and it was made for laptops because laptops don't have the space to do full board expansions. So you could do certain kinds of expansions. Network cards were a particularly popular one that you could plug into a PCMCIA slot that was suited for a laptop and its smaller footprint. This is a pricier solution for expandability. And the only reason it makes sense is because you have a computer that's so small you literally can't do a standard expansion board. I see you nodding, Jeff. Go off on this.
I have a deep, abiding hatred of the PCMIA slot. For many, many reasons. We have such fun things as, I want to do a network thing, so I plug it into the PCMIA slot. I don't have a network jack on that. I have to have a dongle.
Yes.
We do not like having the dongle, because the dongle will be very, very hard to plug in and cause so much of a headache because it's not properly recognized, or you reseat it, or it gets bumped a little bit, or it rips out and pulls the PCMIA card with it, or a myriad of other things. The only network PCMIA slot card I ever liked was one that actually had the RJ45 jacks literally built into the card as this little, ballooning thing outside of it to plug in. Now, you might be saying, but Jeffrey, why do you hate PCMIA cards? It's just a relic of the 90s. You just had to suffer with it for a little bit. Oh, dear listener, I still suffer with it. Why? Because I work at a manufacturing company that had old milling machines, and someone decided that it was a smart idea to put laptop hardware into the Windows system that controls the milling machine.
Yeah.
Said, laptop hardware has PCMIA slots with dongles trying to connect to a network. Yes, these are still in service. Yes, I have a little brown box full of PCMIA cards and dongles that I have written on it, pray you never have to open this box. I have opinions. But do go on.
Indeed. So it has these features that nobody wants, that drive up the price for no good reason. And it's no kind of upgrade over an Amiga 500 or the Amiga 500 Plus, a slightly enhanced version that does come out at the end of 1991, beginning of 1992. But Sydnes decides that this is the thing that they're going to release. So it releases in March 1992, and in order to make sure that it sells, they discontinue the Amiga 500 and the Amiga 500 Plus to sell the Amiga 600, which nobody wants. Then they do one better, because they finally create a decent upgrade later in 1992. Called the A1200, the Amiga 1200, that is actually a decent upgrade over the Amiga 500. But because of the financial difficulties that they're starting to have again at this time, it's really bad. The Amiga 600 is a disaster. There's a dip, a brief dip in the PC clone market in this time period that is basically the low end being wiped out as the 486s come in, like nobody wants 286s anymore. Commodore is heavily embedded in the low end of the market, and Sydnes really pushed them into the low end of the PC clone market. That market collapses, so they lose a ton of revenue from the PC clone market. The 600 is something nobody wants. It's a disaster. The CDTV, which we're not going to cover in detail here. One of these days, we're going to do an episode on these multimedia systems. But suffice it to say, the CDTV, which comes out in 1991, ends up being a product nobody wants and is also a disaster. Sydnes is fired on July 28th, 1992. The CDTV is not his fault, but the 600, the 2200, and the low-end PC clone mess are all his mess. Ali starts moving manufacturing. They close their Hong Kong plant that they've had forever. They close their German plant. They're going to do contract manufacturing primarily in the Philippines. Another former IBM engineer, Lou Egbrecht, takes over engineering from Sydnes. Egbrecht was actually the principal architect of the original IBM PC. He actually knows what he's doing. He actually kind of gets engineering on track, and they start making things again. They've got this great computer that's coming, the A1200, the Amiga 1200. I mean, it's on the low end. It's not like a new fancy bells and whistles thing, but it's a credible successor to the A500. They're going to manufacture it in the Philippines, and then Mount Pinatubo has its huge eruption, the second largest volcanic eruption of the 20th century, like huge eruption. The A1200 was supposed to come out around October 1992, but because of the volcanic eruption, it gets delayed, but they already announced it was coming. So people already knew about it and knew the specs. So then Commodore decides, okay, we can't get the A1200 out, so we'll just flood the channel with A600s instead. But A600s, everybody already hates. They know the A1200 is coming. Do you think people bought the A600?
I'll take no for 500, Alex.
Are you familiar with the Osborne effect?
I'm probably familiar with its definition, but not the term.
It's named for Osborne computers. Basically, what it is what happens when you announce a new product that's so awesome, nobody wants to buy your current product. So nobody buys your current product, but your new product isn't out yet. So you get no money. The Osborne effect is killing demand for your own product by announcing a better product that is not yet available.
A lot of what happened with Sega, the Dreamcast, and the Saturn.
Yeah, a little bit in the last days of the Saturn for sure. More importantly, what happens to Commodore in holiday 1992 when they are absolutely destroyed? It's the Commodore curse. Very briefly in 1991, they become a billion-dollar company again. It's not quite the heights of 1984, but in 1991, they reach $1.04 billion in revenue. Only $48 million in profit, because a lot of that's the PC clone business and other low-margin things. Very quickly after that, sales start falling until in the 1993 fiscal year, which remember, June 30th. So that's counting that holiday 1992. They reach a low of $590 million. They fall from $1.04 billion in 1991 to $911 million in 1992, just a small decline, and then $590 million, a fall all the way to $590 million in 1993, and they lose $356 million.
Or more or less over the course of 2 years, losing almost 40 to 50% of your company value.
I mean, it's just ugly for all of the reasons we've discussed, because the CDTV is a disaster. Obviously, they retreat from the low end again. They miss their opportunity to do the C65 because it keeps getting delayed and delayed and delayed. By the time it looks like they can finally release it in the early 90s, it's too late because the market's moved on to 16-bit video game systems. So the C65 never comes out. They're botching the Amiga market. They're putting out these 600s nobody wants. The PC clone market is a disaster. And, you know, the thing is, the Amiga has long since stopped being a premier game machine. The coming of 3D graphics basically ends any chance for the Amiga to continue to be viable. It was impressive as a game machine in 1985, 1986, but the world's moved on. The PC has improved, VGA graphics, SVGA graphics. You have games like Wolfenstein 3D coming out now. And you see, there's a fatal flaw for modern computer games, modern as of the early 1990s, with Amiga computers. They use planar pixels instead of chunky pixels. What this means, and I'm not a technical person, just bear with me, but basically, with planar graphics, which are more efficient in a low memory environment, which is what you had in the mid-1980s, so it made sense when you had less memory to do this. Each color component, RGB, is stored in a different section of memory. So in order to put the graphics on the screen, to get each pixel, to set a pixel on the screen, you have to pull from multiple sections of memory. Chunky, as the name kind of implies, all the information is in one memory block. Planar makes sense in a low memory environment, but it's dead slow versus chunky because you're having to pull from different parts of memory instead of everything being in sequence. That becomes a death knell when you have games like Wolfenstein that are pushing pixels and moving at a rapid rate in first person. So they've lost their edge. Bad engineering, delayed chipsets, poorly realized side projects like the CDTV, the constant back and forth between let's do the low end, no, let's do the high end, low end, high end. The constant executive churn as Gould tries to find someone who can improve sales in North America. It all takes its toll until we get this situation in 1993 where they're losing over $300 million. The last thing that they try to bank a recovery on is, of all things, re-entering the video game industry again with a basically modified Amiga 1200 architecture that is optimized to be a video game system, the CD32. The idea is that they'll be able to leapfrog the current 16-bit systems from Nintendo and Sega and get something to market before things like the PlayStation and the Saturn reach the market. They can use their Amiga technology to provide this game system that people will love. It doesn't work. For one thing, they have to release it in 1993 when it probably really should have been released a year later in 1994 because they need to get a product out because they're hemorrhaging and their creditors aren't going to let this go on for long. But there are no games ready for it. There are a few companies working on games for it, but they're not ready. So the games that they're going to have are just A1200 ports. It is a better hardware than the A1200, so A1200 ports aren't really going to show off the system. Then, because of all of their problems and their continued manufacturing woes as they move to contract manufacturing, they can't even manufacture enough of them to meet the very small demand that they have for them. I think it was never going to work. There is not a world where the CD32 dominated the video game industry.
It just sounds like a colossal failure of management, failure of logistics, failure of managing expectations, failure of committing all over the place.
Yeah, absolutely. Then a technology that was just out of step because the Amiga was falling further and further behind on what Apple was doing, on what IBM and the clone manufacturers were doing. They couldn't keep up. Amiga hardware would have had to have been completely redesigned to do 3D games.
We've already established if they are the only ones developing the chips, the operating system, the board layouts, the cases, the peripherals, the software, the operating system, the interconnectivity.
Yeah, the operating system. Other companies were doing software, but yeah, the OS in terms of software, they were the only ones doing it. Yeah.
Well, the OS software, but you might still have some certain software for the peripherals and stuff.
Right, absolutely, absolutely.
Even on motherboards, you still have some degree of software with how things interconnect in a BIOS.
Oh, no, of course you do.
They got to reinvent that.
No, I know. And they were doing all that. I just wanted to make sure that we weren't, obviously companies were making games for the system. Apparently, there were a few times where Mahdi Ali botched deals where bigger companies were interested in licensing some aspect of their technology or their OS, and the deals would be nearly done, and then Ali would come in for the final meeting. Other people were negotiating before him, and then he would just demand more, and it would torpedo the deals. Now, would these deals have been enough to save the Amiga technology or Commodore as a company? Probably not. He was hard charging in ways that Jack wasn't. Like, he had some of the same methods of Jack Tramiel, but not in support of the same goals. He was an absentee manager, too, in New York.
I would say he doesn't have it in the same understanding of where to push and where not to push.
Exactly. Now, he was good at restructuring companies. He understood some of the fundamental problems with Commodore. He was right that engineering needed to be fixed. He brought in the wrong person to do it. Bill Sydnes was not the right person to do it, but he was right about that. Some of the restructuring that he helped Rattigan and Gould do in the 80s probably saved the company at that time. Like, he wasn't completely inept, but he didn't understand the markets. He didn't have a consistent vision. Like Gould, he was an absentee manager working out of New York instead of out of Pennsylvania, where the company was. He didn't motivate people in the right way. He could do something similar to a Jack Attack, but with a very different result. I don't think Ali is primarily responsible for running the company to the ground. Certainly the people that were at Commodore blame him and Gould for everything. I mean, they deserve most of that blame. Like, I'm not trying to rehabilitate. This isn't like where I do a Ray Kassar episode and I'm like, well, he did some bad things, but also consider this. Like I said, there are a couple of restructuring things that he had the right idea on, so he wasn't a total waste of space, but he chose the wrong people, and he couldn't push the company in the direction he needed to go, and they just kept falling further and further behind as they switched priorities, ping-pong back and forth, and finally, in 1994, with these mounting losses, went bankrupt. And that was the end. I know it was a bit of a whirlwind here, but like I said, we didn't want to do 5 episodes. We could have probably split this up into 2 more episodes and gone into more details on some of the nuance. There are projects we didn't mention. There are computers we didn't mention. But hopefully, at least from this episode, you get the takeaway that after Jack Tramiel left, there was just that lack of consistent drive to completion on projects, and things just kind of started meandering. Nothing ever got finished, and they fell further and further behind until finally they were too far behind. They screwed up too much. They had products out there that nobody wanted. Their sales tanked, and the company tanked soon after.
I almost wonder if you still had Tramiel there to have the vision, and then Ali to help restructure things a little bit too. Sort of like working in tandem, where he would be working on fixing up that engineering problem. Yeah, he picked the wrong guy to start with, but ultimately did help fix that up. Then you have Jack just being like, okay, we are going to do this. We are going to do it to completion. Then we are going to pivot.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we have to remember that Tramiel was still in the business during this time period, and the Atari Corporation story is pretty much just as ugly. It's not like Jack Tramiel was succeeding where Commodore failed. But maybe you needed that Jack Tramiel, Irving Gould kind of connection. Jack Tramiel chafed under Irving Gould's control. Maybe Gould kept him just hungry enough and just focused enough that that's what he needed to push forward. Maybe that was the best partnership. Certainly it's the partnership that had the best results, though. At the end of the day, Jack had other problems like not believing in software and whatnot that I think as the decade wore on was going to get anyone in trouble. So I don't know. It's interesting to think about. There may be some combination of Gould, Tramiel, somebody else that could have done a better job. The entire back part of the history of Commodore is definitely Irving Gould trying to recapture that magic that he had in the Jack years and never being quite able to find it. He thought he had his man in Ali, and he really didn't. So there you go. Not to belabor it too much more, because this is a long episode.
This is a long series. We got 4 episodes of Commodore here.
But there's the high-level look at how the company kind of fell apart. If you want more of the nitty-gritty details, Bagnell's got that trilogy of books. Definitely recommend you check them out.
All right, Alex, the holidays are upon us. It's December 1st when this episode comes out. The next one's going to be December 15th, then New Year, January 1st. So what is going to be our holiday episodes this year?
Well, I mean, we don't really do holiday episodes. We did it twice because there were 2 nice holiday stories 2 years in a row, but that was really coincidence. No, we got to go back. Before this Commodore craziness started, we had said that we were going to take a look at the 1985 law that regulated the game centers in Japan. Time got away from us, so we ended up going straight into the live stream episodes instead of doing that episode before the first Commodore episode. So now we'll come back to that and kind of take a look at the wild story of how the extension of that law was passed and what it meant for game centers in Japan in the middle of the 1980s.
Okay, kids, if you haven't had enough legal shenanigans, you can cuddle around a fire, enjoy your popcorn, open a present, and listen to more legal corporate shenanigans. Next time on They Create Worlds. Check out our show notes at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, where we have links to some of the things we discussed in this and other episodes. You can check out Alex's video game history blog at videogamehistorian.wordpress.com. Alex's book, They Create Worlds, the story of the people and companies that shaped the video game industry, Volume 1, can now be ordered through CRC Press and at major online retailers. Feel free to email us at feedback@theycreateworlds.com. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/theycreateworld. If you do sign up, please do so through the website and not through the iOS app. This saves you from the 30% Apple markup. We understand that you may not be able to financially support us, but you can still support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcasting service that you use. We have the podcast available on YouTube. Feel free to like and subscribe. Intro music is Airplane Mode by Josh Woodward, found at joshwoodward.com/song/airplane mode, used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Outro music is Back to Your Love by Roll Music, found at freemusicarchive.org, used under the Creative Commons Attribution license. 4 episodes of Commodore, 3 episodes of Price Wars. Who knows what other horrors befall us?